Well, good morning to all. Today will be the last lesson in this series of lessons we've had on the time between the Testaments. And I hope to have kind of a little wrap up at the very end of our lesson today. I will say that a lot of the things we've looked at aren't explicitly explained in the Bible, but many of them are prophesied in the Old Testament and took place in the time of the silence between the Testaments. And some of those things that happened in the time between Testaments affected the first century. And we're going to talk about some of those today and try to wrap it all up together. Before we begin, I'd like to have a word of prayer. If you would, Anthony, would you mind leading us in that prayer?
Our dear, most gracious Heavenly Father, we are so thankful for this day and the blessings that you have bestowed upon us. Father, we are so thankful that we can gather here together under one roof in the comfort of this building, that we may be able to open up your word and to learn more about you. And Father, we pray that what we learn here today, that we will apply to our lives, teach others, and hopefully win more souls to you. Father, we pray that you be with Brother Doug, that he may have a ready recollection of the things that you have prepared. We pray that you continue to bless him and give him a long life in your kingdom. Father, we pray that what we do here today be pleasing to you and according to your will. It's in your Son's holy name that we do pray.
Amen. I've entitled the lesson today, Where Did That Come From? And what I did was go through the New Testament and notice some things that are mentioned there, and they have a direct effect on what Jesus did, what he said, what the apostles did, and what they said, and how the Jews treated him or the Romans. In other words, how did certain things that were in effect, I'll say, in the first century, how did they affect the coming of the gospel? And they're in no particular order. First one is we find mentioned in John 10:22, starting in verse 22. I want to read 3 or 4 verses there. And at that time, the feast of the dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter. And Jesus was walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon. The Jews therefore gathered around him and were saying to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you're the Christ, tell us plainly." And Jesus answered them, "I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name, these bear witness of me." So Jesus here in this situation, in this instance, is asked, "Are you the Christ?" And he more or less says, "Yes, I told you, but you're not paying attention. The things I do bear witness of that." Well, what was the occasion? The Feast of the Dedication. Anybody know what that is off the top of your head? What? No. It's actually still celebrated today, and we'll get to that in a minute. Feast of Dedication was established way back in the Old Testament. It started in the time between Testaments. It was the Maccabees. We've talked about a man named Antiochus Epiphanes. He was, that stands for Antiochus the Illustrious. He gave himself the illustrious name. The Jews called him Antiochus Epiphanes, which to them meant Antiochus the Mad. And I don't mean angry, even though he was that. I think it meant he was crazy, and he was that too. But in the time between the Testaments, when he was the Greek ruler of the Seleucids, he had come through, he had taken Jerusalem, and he proceeded on down to Egypt to try to take Egypt from the Ptolemaic king there. And while he was engaged in war down in Egypt, a rumor drifted back to Jerusalem that he had been killed in battle. the Jews in Jerusalem celebrated. They were happy. Apparently they had big demonstrations or something, but the word got back to Antiochus down in Egypt, and he immediately left the battle there and headed straight back to Jerusalem. And when he got there, he executed, I think, about 30,000 Jews. He desecrated the temple. He put up a statue of Zeus, or Jupiter, if you want to call the Roman name, the king of the gods there. He offered sacrifices on the altar inside the temple, not to God, but to Zeus. And the sacrifice meat was pork. It was pig. Of course, that's an unclean animal to the Jews. He established temple worship that was in the temple with temple prostitutes. He totally desecrated the temple, and he did it on purpose. He wanted to eliminate the Jews. All his activities led to the revolt that we talked about a week or so back of the Maccabees. And eventually, this rebellion, which started out very small with just a few people, grew and grew. And from a guerrilla warfare standpoint, it became an all-out war. And the Maccabees took back Jerusalem. And when they took it back, they cleansed the temple. And they took down all the altars to Zeus, took down the statue of Zeus, cleaned it totally, did everything they could to make it holy again. And they established, and one of the things they did at their rededication temple is they lit the candlesticks or the lampstand that was in the temple. But they had special oil. It had to be pure virgin olive oil that they used, and they only had a small amount. So the story goes. And they had enough to last for one day. So they poured the oil in the lamp, lit the candlesticks or the arms of it. There were 6 of them. And the oil that was supposed to only last one day lasted 12 days. And so they established what they called the Festival of Lights, or the Feast of the Dedication. And it lasts to this very day. Today it's called Hanukkah. And most of you have heard of that. And it is a celebration of that one thing that happened way back in time between the Testaments. So it had an effect on the New Testament because during that feast there were Jews gathered together in the temple, and they were gathered in synagogues, and they asked Jesus, "Are you the Christ?" And he said, "Yes." So that's where the Feast of the Dedication came from. Something that happened during the reign of the Maccabees in the time between the Testaments. Another thing, and I've mentioned this, I think, a few times, the traditions of the elders. In Mark 7:3, we read these words: "For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they carefully wash their hands, thus observing the traditions of the elders." And there were many, many of these traditions. They came about during the time between the Testaments. The Pharisees came up with these, and they were called oral traditions. And by the time the first century rolled around, many of these have been written down and were in a book called the Mishnah. And they came to be, by that time, regarded as more important to follow than the actual Old Testament scriptures. And the Pharisees in particular sought to follow them. And they had many effects on the first century and the Jews that lived in Jerusalem and around the world. And one of the things they included was ceremonial hand washing before meals and after returning from the marketplace. I've mentioned a few of those. They got to be somewhat ridiculous, and they got to be ways around the law of Moses sometimes. One example of that is one of their traditions was you couldn't swat at a fly on the Sabbath. Why? Because that was considered hunting, which was work. So you couldn't swat at the fly. Women weren't allowed to look in a mirror. I may have mentioned this before, because they might see a gray hair and pluck it out. And that was considered work. So you can't pull a gray hair on the Sabbath, because the Sabbath, the actual law of Moses said you weren't supposed to work, but that's what they extended it to, and that's that particular thing. Here's one I thought, this caught my eye. Eating radish was permitted on the Sabbath, but you couldn't dip it in salt. Why? Because that was considered pickling, and that was work. So you could eat a radish, but you couldn't put salt on it. Now this is the extent to some of these oral traditions, how ridiculous they seemed. And I've mentioned about fire. They were not to start a fire or put a fire out on the Sabbath, even if it was their house. And I think I mentioned already, you were not allowed to grab your clothes. If your house caught on fire, you were not allowed to grab your clothes and carry them out, because that was work. But if you put on 2 or 3 layers, it was okay to wear them out. Another thing that had to do with the fire, if your house caught on fire, you weren't allowed to put it out. But you could call a Gentile, not subject to the oral traditions, but you couldn't ask him to put out the fire, but you could say to him, whoever extinguishes this fire will not lose. So as long as you didn't actually put out the fire, and you didn't ask someone to put out the fire, but you just said, well, if anybody doesn't put out, if anyone will put out that fire, they won't lose. Probably implying they'll get a reward. And there are many, many more of these oral traditions that the Pharisees followed to the letter, if you will. And they accused Jesus and his apostles of not following them on occasion, like not washing their hands before they eat. Now, it's a good idea to wash your hands before you eat, if they're dirty. If you go to the doctor, if you'll notice, every time that doctor, after he's talked to you, checked you out or whatever, usually before he leaves the room you're in, he washes his hands. Well, there's a reason for that. And it's a good reason. And there's nothing wrong with washing your hands. But it wasn't a command of the law of Moses. And the Pharisees made it into something that was more important, that they had to do, and they condemned Jesus for not washing his hands before he ate. Another verse that I like to mention with regard to the oral traditions of the Pharisees is Matthew 15:9. But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men. And that is exactly what they did. They had their own precepts, these oral traditions, and they taught them as doctrine, as Bible doctrine, as scriptural. And they weren't at all. They were all made up by men. They did have a great effect on the people of the first century, and even on Jesus and the Jews. Another thing I mentioned, I'm pretty sure at least once or twice, is the publicans, the tax collectors. And I wanted to mention a couple of verses to give you another example of that. In Matthew 9:10, we're reading, it came to pass, as he sat at meat in his house, behold, many publicans and sinners came and sat down with Jesus and his disciples. Many publicans and sinners. You'll find that phrase more than once in the New Testament. Luke 5, verse 29 and 30. And Levi made him a great feast at his house. Levi was a publican. Who was Levi? That's another name for Matthew, the apostle Matthew. He was a publican. And after he was called to be an apostle, when Jesus called him, he had a feast at his house for Jesus. And this is what Luke 5 talks about. Levi made him a great feast in his house. There was a great multitude of publicans and of others that were sitting at meat with him. And the Pharisees and their scribes murmured against his disciples, saying, why do you eat and drink with the publicans and sinners? A publican was considered a sinner. Many of them were. And I've talked about how they collected taxes. A man would go to Rome before the Roman Senate and make a bid to be the tax collector for an area. And if, his highest bidder won. And once he got that bid, he had a contract with the Romans, and he was to deliver that amount every year. And how he got that amount was really up to him. And if he collected extra, he was expected to by the Romans. That would be his salary, his pay. but he was given free rein as to how much salary he made. Now, how many of us in here, if your boss came in and said, all right, I'm going to give you a raise. How much raise do you want this year? Would you say, oh, 3% is plenty? He says, no limit to this now, whatever you want. Well, maybe 5%. Well, maybe, you know, how would I react to that? I never got a raise that I thought was too big. I'll just say that. You may not be that way, but that's the way I was. They seem to come few and far between to me, even though they usually came every year, not always. And sometimes they were okay, and sometimes they were pretty small. But these publicans could pick their own salary, and so they did. And they were despised by the Jews because many of them were Jews. And they were seen not only as being greedy, but also as working with the Romans, which many of the Jews didn't like anyway. But I want to emphasize not all publicans were bad. Matthew was a publican. We don't have any indication in the Bible as to whether he collected too much or not. I find it hard to believe that he did. I believe he was a good man and Jesus chose him because of that. Or at least partly, yes.
I'd like to say there are some people who have good work ethics and some do not. Some work at the job, some slack.
That's true. That's true. If a publican was slack and he didn't make his contract at the end of the year, the Romans took a very dim view of that. But if he paid that contract and he got rich doing it, the Romans didn't really care. They no guidelines at all. Now, how would you like it today if the IRS came to your house and said, hey, we decided to audit you this year. I decided you didn't pay enough and you owe twice as much now. Oh, and by the way, I get to keep that extra 100%. What would you think about that man or woman? You'd have a dim view of him. You know, our laws don't allow that, but Roman law did. So the Republicans were looked down on, and they're mentioned many times in the Bible, but not always in a bad note. Matthew was a publican. Zacchaeus was one. And remember, Zacchaeus told Jesus when he had him in his house, Luke 19:8, we read, Zacchaeus stopped and said to the Lord, Lord, behold, half of my possessions I give to the poor, and if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will give him back 4 times as much. So Zacchaeus apparently was a good man and a good Republican. He was still a wealthy man, we read, but he was not a bad publican. We also read about it in Luke 18, read about 2 men saying a prayer. One was what? A Pharisee, and the other one, a publican. And the Pharisee did what many of the Pharisees did. They made a big show of it. And he even said, thank you, God, that I'm not like this sinner over here, this publican. But what did the publican pray? Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. And Jesus said which prayer was more effective? The publicans. So I guess the bottom line is, if you're a Republican in the first century, you didn't have to be bad. You could be a good man, a good tax collector. Same thing's true today. Matter of fact, there are more than one verse in the Bible that indicate to us we are supposed to pay our taxes. I'm glad it doesn't say you have to be happy about it. I have a problem being happy about it, but we are supposed to pay our taxes. I mean, Jesus was asked directly about that. And we're told in Romans 13, the government's there for a reason, and we pay our taxes to support that government. Not to say that governments can't be corrupt and charge too much, which they have many times throughout history, but a Christian should pay our taxes. Whatever the law is, we're supposed to obey it, unless it's against God's law. And God's law nowhere says don't pay your income tax or whatever tax you have to pay. I wanted to mention something else that's mentioned in 1 Corinthians 9:25. And 1 Corinthians 9:25 says, and everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Now, Paul was making an example, and that people could understand. Those who compete in the games, they exercise self-control. And what Paul was talking about is what we call the Olympics. They existed then. They began actually in 776 BC as a festival of Zeus, the king of the Greek gods. And they grew through the years. Eventually, they were abandoned for a while, but then they were resumed about 1890 or something like that. And that became what we have today as the Olympics, which we have every 4 years. I think we've got them coming up this next winter, in February, I believe, the Winter Olympics. Well, everyone now and everyone then knows that those athletes that compete in those games have to exercise self-control because they have to train and train hard. And that takes self-control. But they're doing it for a reason. And Paul says they're doing it for a wreath. In the first century, the prize wasn't a gold medal, it was a wreath, an olive wreath. And it symbolized that they had won their game, their event. And I say everybody then, like everybody today, understands if you're going to be successful as an athlete, you've got to train, you've got to practice, you've got to exercise self-control. And Paul was telling the Christians, we do the same thing. We need to train, we need to exercise self-control, we need to practice, we need to learn. Not for a perishable wreath like the Olympic Games winner got, or not for a gold medal like they get today, but we do it for something that's imperishable. That's a home in heaven. So the games existed in the first century, and they exist today. Matthew 5:41, we'll read these words. It's part of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus speaking and says, whoever shall force you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Where did that come from? Who was forced to go 1 mile? Why were they forced? Well, the origin of this actually began back in the Old Testament, in the days of the Persians, probably with an edict issued by King Cyrus of Persia. The messengers of the Persian kings were allowed to, when they were delivering a message, when their horse tired, they were allowed to take the horse of any citizen, anybody, and take that horse so they could get on the horse and deliver the message faster. This was all done in the interest of delivering messages as fast as possible. And it was legal for them to take anybody's horse to help them deliver their message. Well, this tradition or this law persisted through the Greek Empire and in the days of the Roman Empire. But by the time the first century rolled around, it had kind of morphed into something a little different. It wasn't for delivering messages, but a Roman soldier could compel any Jew in Judea to carry his pack or his gear for 1 mile. And the Jew, if he didn't do it, he was breaking the Roman law, and he could suffer the consequences. Well, the Jews didn't like doing this. They hated it so much, some of them would mark the distance from their house. And when they got to that marker, they'd drop the pack and tell the Roman soldier, I don't have to go any further. Well, what Jesus was teaching in the Sermon on the Mount was, don't stop at the first mile, go the second mile. Now, what was he saying? Do more than you have to do. Now, we can apply this to many things. Our soldiers today can't compel us to carry their pack. But in our jobs, can we do more than we have to do? Yes.
You've heard it, I've heard it. I've seen people that when you talk to them about their attendance, their response is, well, I'm only required to be there, Sunday morning and participate in worship.
Yeah.
Or supper. Nothing says I have to be there on Sunday night or Wednesday night or other functions that
Yeah.
church is very applicable.
Well, I could argue about that.
Christianity is
Yeah.
about doing the minimum.
Yeah, it's about going the second mile. We need to apply that spiritually, whether that's to our study, whether that's to our helping others, teaching others, or whatever. Christians should have the attitude, I will do more than is required of me. I won't do the bare minimum. I don't think God wants us. I don't want the bare minimum of a chance to get into heaven. Sorry, I want a little more than that. So we need to do more than we have to do. Go the second mile. Jesus taught it explicitly, and we need to apply that to our lives in our jobs, in our raising of our children, in our duties as a Christian, in our attendance to worship, in everything. Have the attitude, I'll do more than I'm required. Well, yes, ma'am. Christ, how far did he go? Yeah. He gave it all. He went all the way. We need to try to have the attitude, we need to be like Christ, be willing to go all the way if it's required of us. But that tradition that was on Roman law in the first century got its beginning hundreds of years earlier. But there's nothing wrong with that tradition, and Jesus even tells us we need to go that second mile. In Mark 15:15 and at other accounts of the crucifixion, we read about something called scourging. We had a class, did you talk about that, Ron, scourging? Yeah, recently. But in Mark 15:15, we read these words, wishing to satisfy the multitude, Pilate released Barabbas for them, and having Jesus scourged, he delivered him to be crucified. In the first century, the Romans had developed the habit of scourging someone before they crucified them. And Ron explained in the class Wednesday night, a week or two back, what it involved. Scourging got its origin probably with the Persians, maybe with the Assyrians before that. But it persisted on down through the years until we get to the Romans. And the Romans, as was their habit, they kind of perfected it a little bit. They used a whip, what we call whip, they called it a flagrum, and it had strips at the end, and they had pieces of sharp metal or bone in it. You may have heard of something called a cat of nine tails. That's what I would describe the scourging implement to be. And it was something that they did many times. Now, scourging to the Jews was not to go beyond 40 lashes. So they stopped at 39, just to be sure they didn't go too far. Of course, under scourging, many men, all of them suffered, many died, because it was a brutal thing and they bled a lot. And Jesus suffered that. In the Jewish Torah, the amendment was 40, as I said. And they would scourge a man 40 times, save one. Just in case they counted wrong, they didn't want to go to 41. By the time they got to 40, the man probably didn't know the difference. But anyway, that was a tradition of the Jews. The Romans didn't have that tradition, but it originated hundreds of years before Christ lived on the earth, but he had to suffer it. And then he had to go be crucified. And the crucifixions. And there are 4 accounts of crucifixion, Matthew 27, Mark 15, Luke 23, and John 19. And they all talk about the crucifixion. And the origin of crucifixion is not really known, but it probably also originated with the Persians or perhaps the Assyrians. It was practiced by the Greeks quite a bit. We talked about when Alexander took Tyre, he crucified 2,000 of the survivors, all the men that were left in Tyre. He crucified them on the beach. You read about in history the slave rebellion led by Spartacus against Rome in 71 BC. After that was put down, the Romans crucified 6,000 of those rebellious slaves. Tradition says they were crucified in the Appian Way, and they never took their bodies down. They just left them up there for the birds to pick at. As an example of what happened to you if you fought against the Roman government. Ron mentioned this, and I had not heard it, so I did a little research, and what he said was right. Usually, the upright post, was only 6 or 7 feet above the ground. So the depictions we have of the cross with Jesus hanging 10, 15 feet above the ground are probably inaccurate. In all likelihood, he was just about 6 or 7 feet off the ground, and that way he could see you eye to eye, or you could see him eye to eye. And of course, they did use nails, the spikes that they had as nails in those days, and they wanted to make sure it was painful as can be. Usually the cause of death was suffocation, because you had to raise up so you can inhale and exhale. And after a while, the pain in your feet got so bad you couldn't do that, and the weakness. Of course, there was loss of blood. Sometimes men would survive a few days, but usually they didn't. But it was a terrible way to die, most humiliating way to die, and Jesus suffered that death. And the Romans, like I say, they made sure it was a terrible way to die. We read that Jesus died after only a short time, and when the Jews went to Pilate to ask him to hurry up the death of those on the cross, Jesus and the robbers, the Jews their law said to them they weren't supposed to leave a man hanging on a tree on the Sabbath. So they wanted those men to die so the bodies could be taken down before the Sabbath. And of course, they got to Jesus. He was already dead, but the Roman soldier there, to be sure, went ahead and stabbed him with his spear to make sure he was dead. And that's where we read out the blood came gushing out, blood and water. But crucifixion, of course, is mentioned in the Bible. Jesus went through it, and we are to go through it as Christians. We are to be, in a sense, crucified with Jesus. And we are to die with him as he died, be buried, and raise up in baptism. So crucifixion was, like I say, it's mentioned in the New Testament, had its origins way before the time of the New Testament, actually before the time between the Testaments. But Rome had made it pretty effective, pretty gruesome. In Mark 15:22, about the crucifixion, we read these words: "They brought him to the place Golgotha," which is translated place of a skull. Golgotha is the Greek spelling of the Aramaic word, which means place of a skull. And Greek was the common language. And thus, in that account, it's called Golgotha. In Luke 23, it's called something else. Luke 23:33 read, "And when they were come to the place which is called Calvary, there they crucified him and the malefactors, one on the right and the other on the left." Calvary was the Latin word for place of a skull. So they mean the same thing. One of them is a Greek word and one of them is a Latin word. Of course, Latin was the official language of the Romans, even though many of them spoke Greek. But we have both used in the New Testament. But don't get confused, they're the same thing and mean the same thing, just in different languages. Another thing we read about quite a bit in the New Testament, something called a synagogue. Now, synagogues were gathering places of the Jews, and they would gather there on the Sabbath to worship and teach or to be taught the law. They probably had their origin, and they aren't mentioned in the Old Testament. They probably had their origin, and again, this is somewhat speculation, during the time of the captivity in Babylon. In Jerusalem, the Jews gathered in the temple to worship. Well, when they were taken off to Babylon, they couldn't do that. And so they began gathering in places that came to be known as synagogues. And during the time of the Greek Empire, when Jews were scattered throughout the Greek Empire, everywhere there was, and the tradition was if there were 10 families of Jews, a synagogue should be set up. And they would set up a synagogue, a place where they could gather on the Sabbath and have the law read to them, have the law explained to them, and a place for them to worship. And the synagogues, of course, were very important in New Testament times. Where did Paul go when he went on his missionary journeys? First thing he did when he got to a new town, go to the synagogue and begin teaching. Almost every town he went to the synagogue, because there you would find people, Jewish people, who were religious. Jewish people who were supposed to know the law, which meant they knew about the coming Messiah or the prophecies concerning Messiah, and prophecies that should have told them that Jesus was the Messiah. Of course, they didn't see that in many cases. But the synagogues played an important role in the New Testament. And they had their beginning and probably really spread throughout what was then the Roman Empire in the first century during the time of the Greeks. As the Jews were scattered in what's called the diaspora, they were dissipated throughout the Greek Empire, and they set up synagogues all over the place, in every town just about. I wanted to mention, well, let me read Acts 17:18. This is, Paul is in Athens. And also some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him, and some were saying, what would this idle babbler wish to say? Others, he seemed to be a proclaimer of strange deities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. Some of the Stoics and Epicurean philosophers. Well, the Stoics were a class or school of Hellenistic philosophy founded in the 3rd century BC by some of those Greek philosophers. The Stoics considered passionate emotions to be the results of errors in judgment, and that a sage or a person of moral and intellectual perfection would not have these emotions. The Stoics didn't believe in expressing emotion, and that's what that word means in our language today. If he's a Stoic, he's doesn't express emotion, just kind of stern all the time. That philosophy or that attitude began back in the time of the Greek philosophers in the time of the Grecian Empire. And it existed in the 1st century. And Paul encountered them in Athens as they were discussing the things they discussed, and Paul went to them and talked to them. And eventually he was telling about Jesus and told them about what that unknown God that they didn't know what he was or what it was, that there was an unknown God to them. It was the God that created the world. The other group that's mentioned in that same verse is the Epicureans. Say it right, Douglas. Epicureanism is a system of philosophy based on the teachings of a man named Epicurus, founded in 307 BC, in the time between the Testaments. It was really a form of what we call today hedonism, that pleasure was the highest good. The Epicureans themselves regarded mental pleasure as more highly than physical pleasure. Even though physical pleasure was highly sought, mental pleasure was higher. And they held the idea that the ultimate pleasure to be held was freedom from anxiety and mental pain. I have no problem being free from mental anxiety and mental pain, but pleasure was their goal. And that goal exists today. Many people seek only pleasure. If you watch a football game on TV, you'll see advertisements for beer, for instance. And what are the people in that commercial always doing? They're having a good time. Always, without exception, they're having a good time. So the commercial seeks to your hedonistic part, have pleasure, enjoy life, do what feels good. Of course, those commercials don't show you an alcoholic sitting on the side of the street or in the ditch going through withdrawal or something like that. That won't sell much beer. But the people are almost always very young, they're very healthy, They look good, they feel good in the commercial, and they're having a good old time. Well, that idea of hedonism had its, maybe not its origin, but its expression certainly with the Epicureans back in ancient Greece. And it persisted officially in that group of people in the first century. And Paul encountered it at Athens. Another thing to read about in the New Testament, something that Paul did, read about it in Acts 25:11. Paul is on trial here in Acts 25. He, in his defense, says these words: "If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die, but if none of these things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar." The appeal to Caesar. What was that? Well, every free man in Rome, every Roman citizen had the legal right to appeal his trial if it went, decision was against him. If you weren't a Roman citizen, you didn't have that right. But Paul had a Roman father and a Jewish mother. He was by birth a Roman citizen, and he appealed to Caesar. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because it got Paul to Rome. Got him there, and of course, the story of how he got there and the trip is very important, and Paul did some great things there. But he got to Rome and he kept preaching, and he wrote part of the New Testament while in prison in Rome. Well, he got there because he took advantage of Roman law. He appealed to Caesar. He was knowledgeable of it, and he knew what it was for, and he knew what it could do for him. So he took advantage of it. And this was actually written down in Roman law that every Roman citizen could appeal an edict, and ultimately, if he wanted to, appeal to the emperor. And Paul took that advantage. Got to hurry here. I want to mention something. Mark 5:20, we read about, this is about the man named Legion. We read, "He went away and began to proclaim in Decapolis what great things Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled." What's Decapolis? Well, it was a district of northern Palestine with a large Greek population, and it consisted of 10 cities. And Decim is the Greek word for 10, and that's where that came from. We read about it, like I said, Mark 4 and 5, or Mark 5, and in Matthew chapter 4, and also in Mark 7. Real quick, in Mark 12:14, Jesus was asked whether it was lawful to pay a poll tax to Caesar. And Jesus told him, yes, it was. And that poll tax was one of the taxes those publicans collected that didn't stay local. It went directly to Rome, to Caesar. Many of the taxes those publicans collected were used locally to build roads, buildings, docks, support the Roman army in that area. But the poll tax was one sent straight back to the federal government, if you will, in Rome. We read about some men called tetrarchs in the New Testament, and they were Roman leaders, Roman governors, if you will. And that's just one of the titles that's what they were called. We read about them in Luke 3:1. We read about a group of people called Samaritans in the New Testament. Samaritans were hated by the Jews. They came about in the time between the Testaments because they lived in the area of the northern kingdom. Even the northern kingdom didn't exist. But they consisted of people that had been brought in first by the Assyrians and by the Persians to populate the area that the northern kingdom had lived in. And eventually they kind of adopted Jewish religion, but they changed it quite a bit. They had their own temples, they had their own sacrifices, and the Jews hated them. They would avoid going through Samaria, walk miles out of the way to miss Samaria. Jesus didn't do that. You read about that in the New Testament. I'm out of time. I want to mention one more thing, centurions. And we had a lesson about that on Wednesday night. Centurions were Roman leaders in the army. And several times in the New Testament, they're mentioned in a good light. There was a centurion at the cross. He was the one that said, truly, this man was the Son of God. We read about Cornelius, who was a centurion. And he was a good and righteous man. He helped the poor. He was a Roman centurion, but he was still a good man. He became the first Gentile convert to Christianity. A centurion saved Paul's life when he was arrested and about to be killed by the Jews in Jerusalem. A centurion rescued him and took him up to Caesarea so he'd be safe. And like I say, centurions were soldiers, but some of them were good men. And I've always used that example is you can be a soldier and still be a good man. One more thing, you may know this, a denarius. A denarius was a unit of money, usually a coin, a Roman coin made of silver, and it was the usual pay for one day's wages for a laborer. And we read about denarius several times in the New Testament. There were a few more things, but let me just, in a brief moment here, emphasize the reason we studied all these things was so we could understand what happened in the New Testament, better understand it, better understand why the Romans did what they did, why the Jews did what they did, and what they should have done, but that wasn't what happened. And we need to not let the things of this world affect us in the way they affected the Jews in the first century. They rejected Christ because of their expectations, because he wasn't what they wanted, but he was what they needed. And when the time was right, as we read in Galatians 4:4, when the time was right, God sent forth his Son. The time was right. For hundreds of years, that time had been prepared. And when the first century arrived, the time was right. Next week, we're going to have a class about, Anthony's going to start about evidences, and that should be a great study. Hopefully give us more faith that we can count on the Bible as being what God says it is, and some proof that it really is. So you're now dismissed, and thank you for being here.